It gives me great pleasure to welcome my esteemed colleague, Dr. Cameron Cross, who is Associate Professor of Iranian Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Professor Cross's research interests are indeed very capacious and encompass, to use his own words, the literary traditions of the Nile to Oxus region from about 800 to 1200 CE. This is roughly the territorial expanse we ascribe to the Achaemenid Empire and the very focus of much of our scholarship here at UCLA. His recently published monograph, Love at the Crux, The New Persian Romance in a Global Middle Age, with the University of Toronto Press in 2023, explores the emergence of romance as a literary genre in New Persian and the transformation of romantic love into a vehicle of ethical praxis. By exploring Gorgani's masterpiece, Vis Oramin, composed in the mid-11th century, Dr. Cross establishes how court poetry in 11th century reconfigured mythical and epic tales of a distant, maybe imagined past, by lending new meaning to its underlying love story, away from being mere entertainment literature to a vehicle of ethical and political self-inquiry, as he stated. Although differences exist, one is reminded of the function of the amour courtois in medieval literary traditions, which equally harnessed the genre of Romance literature and the love story that underpinned it to tame an aristocratic, tumultuous youth in feudal households. In his talk today, he shall explore in your company the concept of connected texts. That is, I hope I have grasped it correctly. That is, I'm eager to understand whether I've understood it correctly. That is, narrative traditions that presuppose the existence of an ecology of literate audiences within a regional or supra-regional expanse, able to discern the intellectual tenets and aesthetic forms of this text, and thus form the constituents of a broader common world of the mind. Was that correct? I hope. On the strength of these arguments, he shall infer the presence of a global Middle Age. His discussion shall today be performed on the basis of 3 versified stories in Persian, which we are all eager to discover in your company. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shayagan, for inviting me, and thank you to all for coming. It's been a pleasure visiting UCLA for the first time. It's been just a treat. I'm seeing many familiar faces and many new faces, and I look forward to our conversation. And I especially like the roundtable format that we have here, so I'm going to take advantage of it and sort of be here not as not giving a lecture, but sort of in a workshop-y sort of environment where I'll walk you through the work I've done so far and to point towards directions where I hope it will go next. And much of what you're describing in that question of interconnected regions, yeah, I think it kind of points to that. I have this sort of moribund project called the Grammars of Globality, where I'm trying to think about how we can talk about globality or movement within interconnected transregional frameworks. Here, I think I'll try to keep those meta conversations aside a little bit and offer a few concrete examples, and perhaps that might be a good springboard into thinking more about what does it mean to do comparative work in pre-modern studies. So I really want to, again, I really appreciate the invitation, and I wanted to acknowledge Professor Shayagan and some of my other colleagues, Alison Cantor-Botan, Domenico Ingenito, for being part of a very vibrant intellectual community for me. I've benefited tremendously from their work, and also it's been a pleasure to meet the graduate students here at UCLA as well, whose work I found very inspiring. So I mentioned some of the people I've met recently at UCLA, and I wanted to sort of acknowledge, call out to signal how much I appreciate this this community. I also one thing I appreciate about this community is that in previous iterations since, previous talks I've given since the book came out, I've done kind of a walkthrough of the book. This is a community which is, many of you have actually read the book, and so I won't bore you by talking about what the book is about. I'll give you, in a sense, 3 mini talks. Part 1, I'll give you a quick précis or recap of what the book is about, what it's trying to do. focusing on the story of Viso Ramin, but I'll try to keep that part short so we spend more time looking at part 2, which is where I hope to take this idea next, particularly through the prism of 2 very interesting poems, Varg and Gosha and Vamako Azra. So to dive into the first part, Love at a Crux, and this is basically the recap of my book, and so my apologies if this is a little, if it's lost its tazegi, if it's not very fresh anymore. But I did want to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. This was a poem that captivated me from the moment I started reading it. It's called Viso Ramin, written by the poet Fakhreddin Asare Gorgani in the year, I think, about 1054, under the commission of the Seljuk governor of Esfahan, which had recently been conquered by this new dynasty. And the governor actually has this interesting approach where he says, I'm interested in knowing about this local tale, tell me about it. And so there's something about this regional lore impulse that I find interesting. And because of this commission, it is remembered as one of the first independent and really influential romances, or the Dastane-i which we can kind of unpack a little bit, in Persian literature. It was undoubtedly highly impactful for Nezami, who becomes kind of the standard bearer for the genre. And it features the love triangle of Vis, Ramin, and Mobad. And it's one point of interest for many scholars of this text is that it's based on a Pahlavi source text, and may have roots going further back from there, as well as Professor Shaigan has shown. Here's the scene of composition, and I'll read the few lines of the Persian for you, because it sort of captures, I think, the point of interest that this story has held for many scholars of Persian. The text begins, Mara yek ruz goft an qible din, chegui dar hadise Viso Ramin, ke miguyand chizi sakh nikust, dar in keshvar hame kas dararash dust. That Qibla of religion said to me one day, what can you say about the story of Viso Ramin? They say it's a lovely thing and everyone in this region, this Iqlim, loves it. And that's that regional tale. There's something, it seems to be a fairly local story that other poets of Iraq-e-Ajam and Iraq-e-Arab of Baghdad and Esfahan refer to, but it doesn't seem to have been known, or at least there's no reference to such a story in something like the Shahnameh. But it has a very similar sort of origin story. The poet responds, Begoftam kon hadisi sakh zibost, ze gerd avardeye shesh mard danast, nadidam zon nekutar dastani, namonad jos be khorram bustani, valikan pahlavi bashad zabanesh, nadonad har ke barkhanad bayanesh, agar danandei dar ve barad ranj, javad ziba cho por gohar yeki ganj. So his response is that it's a beautiful story that's been compiled by 6 wise men. This is very similar to the story of the composition of the Shahnameh. And then he says, but its language is Pahlavi. And I assure you, article upon article upon article has been published trying to figure out what he means specifically by its language is Pahlavi. What is the source text of this? Because it's like this rare moment of trying to get access to Middle Persian literature. But what's really interesting is that he continues a little later to say, if a scholar, a Donandei, put some work into it, it would become beautiful. And so it's not so much, for me, the point of interest was not so much, what does this tell us about the past, but what does this tell us about the present? What does it do about the work of scholarship, of bringing knowledge to a story to make it beautiful, to make it meaningful in a new context? And so I'll explain a little bit more. I'll return to this point in a few minutes. After it was composed, it seems to have enjoyed a fairly successful reception. It was translated into Georgian, becoming a foundational text in that literary language in the 1150s. It had a clear influence on Nezami Ganjavi. Numerous poets have referred to it, especially up to the Timurid period. And in fact, there's a section of it called the Dahnameh, which becomes a genre unto itself that later poets like Obeid Zalkani and Ahmad Faqi, no, I'm sorry. Oh yeah, I think he has one. Anyways, Homam Tabrizi and Khaju Kerbani also have Dahnamehs. It becomes kind of in vogue in that period. However, it does kind of fall out of favor in the modern period. And a lot of this has to do, I think, because of Nezami's importance. And also it's very, I didn't mention this in the outline, it features adultery and incest. And so these two things were very off-putting for many modern editors of the poem. And so it's been kind of marginalized or even sort of orphanized in the modern reception as sort of like this weird, exceptional, anomalous poem that doesn't really, it counts as an important stepping stone for somebody like Nazami, but it doesn't really have the same staying power in and of itself. This is an interesting series of artworks by Ramin Etemadi Bozorg, who describes Viso Ramin as a story of a secret romance, a lost memory, a forbidden document. And that's kind of its cachet in modern Persian literary studies. And this reputation, this is just one example of a tradition of scholarship that sort of continuously sets Gorgani's work in opposition to Nezami, where the great scholar Hasan Vahid Daskerdi writes that Nezami seems to have been motivated to out of what he calls afsaneis zesht or kitabis doshmane namuso khasme tarikh azamat akhlaqi Iran, like a book that is a disgusting fable, a book hostile to the edicts of law and religion and an enemy to the history of Iran's moral grandeur. So Nezami is sort of responding to the affront that has been caused by the presence of this text. And this is this is kind of expressive of the way that Viso Ramin has often been received in 20th century scholarship. It's not the only branch, but the Persian title of this also describes the love of Viso Ramin as Eshkhaye Faramush Shode, like forgotten love stories, as something that's been marginalized intentionally. That said, there's been a lot of really excellent scholarship that I can on the text that I can sort of summarize in about 3 categories. One is the historical, because being a text of clear ancient provenance, many scholars have done a lot of excellent work exploring it as a historical document, as a philological testament to either new, like that transitional stage from Middle Persian to its recasting as in the Arabic script as New Persian, using it to shed light on the Achaemenid period, as there's an important article by Dr. Shaigan about this, to the Sasanian or the Parthian context of its composition. Minorsky comes to mind. And also Marianne Mollet's study of how it was intended as a document in the Seljuk period. So it's sort of a historical testament, right? The next one is the philological one. I guess that's my second category. That's Gilles Lazare. That's, I think, Parvane Pour Shariati has an article about this, trying to understand what Gorgani means when he says Pahlavi, basically. What can this story tell us in terms of our knowledge of the history of the Persian language itself? And then finally, in literary studies, I write romance, Nezami, and Tristan and Iseult basically to point out that it's often been situated in the study of romance, like Mesami, for example, thinking about romance as a new genre that does certain kinds of ethical work, usually, or as or Bausani's description of the story as like the formative work that establishes the romance genre. Almost always the next person that comes up in that narrative is Nezami Ganjevi, and so therefore much of the work on Viso Ramin is run through the prism of Nezami, usually in unfavorable ways, usually saying that Nezami is the better poet, his work is more interesting, his work is more morally acceptable, and so Viso Ramin often falls under the shadow of Nezami in that way. And the third one is this interesting, perhaps coincidental, perhaps not, set of coincidences between the story of Viso Ramin and the sort of, what's the best word I have, the English or Norman story of Tristan and Iseult, which has many structural and episodic correlations, and so a lot has been written trying to uncover some sort of relationship between these two texts. My interest was to what was I going to do with this field? I was interested in doing a few things. I was interested in thinking about the moment and time in which this was written, and to see if this tells us something about a new interest in love stories in general. As was mentioned in the introduction, there's a history of writing stories and publishing books about lovers, but it seems that at this moment, this genre of storytelling gains a certain kind of cachet, a certain kind of prestige through the work of Gorgani and other poets. And I was also interested in reframing the way we look at the text less through a vertical lens, in terms of like much of the scholarship seemed to be holding it up to the light to see what we could see in the past, or to see how it presages the future. You know, like how does it tell us? What does it tell us about ancient Iran? What does it tell us about Nezami? I was interested in sort of flattening that and looking horizontally at what's going on in the world at the same time, and to look kind of do this lateral comparison to maybe, again, situate it in its historical moment. And so that led me to investigate its connections with Hellenistic, Arabic, and Iranian traditions, thinking about my basic terms were the mythos and the ethos, sort of the story and the ways of telling the story, the sort of ethics that go along with the story that you could draw from with this kind of horizontal framework. And from that, I tried to situate, this goes to the question of the global. One way of thinking comparatively might be to think about a complex in which certain baseline or rock bodies of scholarship or thought, such as Abrahamic revelation or Hellenistic philosophy, could be understood as sort of shared grammar sets, in a sense. You could mention Plato, for example, in the Latin West or in Gorgani's place, and that would be a meaningful name, right? You can mention Moses, and that's a meaningful name across this complex. So now let me tell you a little bit about the Romantic turn. And this was basically something that I observed as I was looking at the very early stages of versification of stories going on in the New Persian language. Much like as we see with the Abbasid court with Arabic in this translation movement, the first things that translators seem to tackle are what we might call wisdom literature, pragmatic questions. And this can include something like the fables of Khalil wa Dimna, or historical narratives about great men, basically, kings, prophets. And we don't have most of these texts, but we can learn something about their titles, that many of these are drawn from the Shahnameh cycle, or the Book of Lords, or from the Barlaam and Yosafat story, the Panchatantra, or the Khalil wa Dimna, stories of the prophets, Shahnameh again, the life of Zoroaster, a medical treatise. These are all works that our Taskere writers tell us were written about in the 10th century under the Samanid period. And their use value is very self-evident, right? You read these works and you learn about protocol, you learn about wisdom, you learn about science. When you move into the end of the Samanid and the beginning of the Ghaznavid period, and I think Ferdowsi's Shahnameh is a very important sort of bridge work in this, it's really interesting. Suddenly you see the poet laureate Onsuri producing 3 independent masnavis about lovers. This is new. And then also you have Ayuri writing the Vargengol Shah from an Arabic source. A few decades later, you have Visoramin written by Gorgani. And so there's this little movement, a little bubble, all basically at the court of Mahmud of Ghazna and then picked up by the Seljuks moving westwards, that then establishes the stories about lovers. You might call them the Dastane-Ashaqane, stories about that describe the adventures of lovers, as a viable topic to versify. That's not, and again, I want to emphasize that this isn't creating something out of whole cloth, it's rather repackaging it and giving it a verse form that makes it that one could present to a patron in a way that was not really deemed acceptable or possible by earlier generations. There's many important odaba, like literateurs, who will describe the tales of lovers and in terms of like, these are good for children, these are good for women. They're not really things that men of high philosophical aspirations ought to read. They're just not that useful. And then looking outward, this is the horizontal axis I was trying to think about. It's really interesting to me that this movement is not confined to the Persianate space. So I was thinking about how in many vernacular traditions, and I think the vernacularity of this is interesting, that these are, by and large, new literary traditions that are emerging in what Hodgson would call the Western oikoumene. In going back to this period I talked about, in the early 11th century, we have this whole of activity in Khorasan and then the Iranian plateau. With the Seljuks, it starts to move westward, and we see works in Georgian appearing. As we move westward in the middle 12th century in Byzantium, there's this bubble of like reviving the ancient Greek novel that takes place. We start seeing the first French romances, Flore and Blanchefleur. Vatil-Himma is an epic in Arabic that is dated to this period, such that by the time we get to the year 1200, you actually have 4 canonical sort of genre-setting writers who are living at exactly the same time. You have Chrétien de Troyes in Old French, who is formative for this genre in French. You have Wolfram von Eschenbach and Gottfried von Strassburg doing the same in Middle German. you have Shoto Rosavelli in Georgian, and you have Nezami of Ganje in Persian. So it's kind of like this cross-transregional phenomenon where romance is really picking up and people are experimenting with this form in various ways. It's very complex, and there's also interesting things going on in Armenian that I won't get into, but people are interested in verifying history, of broadening the horizons of what's possible within a literary language. And that's what I was trying to do with this work, is to situate what's going on in Persian not as a national literature, because that's how often the frame is like the history of Persian literature. First there's the Samanids and the Ghaznavids and the Seljuks, and just kind of focused on this vertical family tree. And I'm looking more rhizomatically, like what's going on laterally around Persian at the same time. So, of course, there's many caveats with this methodology. One is that we have so few sources from this early period. Anything that we think we know is probably not true. There's just so much that's been lost. If there was a movement, maybe there's actually a much bigger movement that took place that we just don't have any evidence of. We also know that the scale of text production really increases in the later periods, and so there may have been a thriving or there may have been a lot of activity going on that was never written down. I'm also very aware of the fact that using a term like romance imposes a prefigured category, and I mean, what do we count in or outside of that category is a very important question to ask. And there's also, you notice that my map is very Eurocentric. I'm sort of looking westward. And one of my interests moving forward is to reorient my own point, my own idea, like what would it look like hypothetically to exclude Europe and think what's going on in Sanskrit or in Chinese literature. Are there comparisons made there that we might think about? My preliminary result so far is that there's a lot going on in Sanskrit that is quite comparable and quite interesting. The Chinese sources are very different. They're like not quite as recognizable to me, and that also is interesting. So these are all kind of caveats about the work so far. But the questions that this method raised for me is that, A, what does it mean to use romance in the Persian tradition? There is no word for romance in Persian. The closest we get is a story about lovers. But there's many other similar words, like a book of love, a book of passion, right? Habasname, Mahabatname. But if we do use, so the idea is to say, maybe I shouldn't recognize romance in this literature, but recognize, rethink the very term itself through this engagement in a way that may also benefit scholars of that genre in other literary traditions as well, the Greek, the French, and so on. But if we do use this as a term of analysis, as a proposition, not as a fact, what could that tell us about a global Middle Ages? Does it change our history of the romance genre, which is, again, in Western scholarship, a pretty Eurocentric and Franco-centric history, right? It begins with Chrétien de Troyes, basically. And it tells us, so with those questions, we get this chance to think about origins, about roots, and sort of recastings, and how this is going on in an interconnected space. And so the kind of method that I use when doing this is to move back and forth between what I might call the substratum of Greek, Arabic, and Middle Persian, what was going on prior to this period, and then reading broadly across European vernaculars, the Christian East, like Greek, Georgian, or Armenian, and then looking at New Persian. So it's like this dialogue, basically, between the past substratum and then the present, i.e., the year 1000 or 1100. So why did I call this book Love at a Crux? It's because beyond the sort of winking self-inscription that Joshua noticed, it's because I wanted to posit this idea of thinking of Iran at the crux of this movement, something that brings together all these divergent traditions and puts them in a crucible, sort of reforges them into something new that has analogs in other literary traditions, in other languages. And that if you were to tell the story of the romance from that perspective, this rise, this bubble, is at the crux of this. It's sort of at this crucial moment where a new appreciation for romance takes place. And the reason why I focused on Visa Ramin is because I felt that it was very aware of that work, almost in a meta way, and it was taking the conventions of that genre and really torturing them, like sort of pushing absurd limits such that they start to fall apart. So it's kind of putting it on a cross. It's torturing the genre to sort of analyze it and tear it apart. So the book is structured out of a passage that happens. This is that self-aware nature of the story, where Gorgani writes near the beginning, Beguyam ta ba to yek hale an ma, che ba daye, che ba ramin, che ba sha, where he's basically saying, if you read the story of that moon, of Vis, vis-a-vis her relationship with the daye, the nurse, the ramin, and the king, you get different accounts. You get different understandings of what happens. So he says, I will tell you a romance, a dastane ashagane, in which love has many a tale. There's many stories within the story. And so I was thinking about this idea of using narratization as a kind of theorization, in the sense of like nazar, meaning theoria, that tells us different, through that polyvocality, it tells us different understandings of what it means to be a lover in the world. And I focused with each character on ethics, politics, and then affect, or maybe poetics might be a better word. And I won't go in, if this was a book talk, I would tell you what I did in each chapter, but I won't do that. I'll just finish by closing with my main takeaways from it, which is that this is also a really interesting moment in the history of fiction studies, because the whole point of this endeavor is to take something that would have been regarded as a fairy tale, basically, something that's set in the world of Yeki Bud, Yeki Nabud, right? That straddles the lines between the real and the fictive, and invites us to exercise our imaginations. And here I think the work of scholarship on like Abdelkader or Giorgiani, for example, of like re-theorizing the function of tahyil, or Avicenna for that matter, of like re-theorizing the importance of fantasy, of image making, is really interesting here, because it allows us to move from the fairly narrow paradigm that has defined storytelling up to that point of like biography, of like lives that matter, to experiences of life that matter. And you go along in your imagination with the experiences of that in your mind, and that can be just as meaningful for you as a reader as it could be to study the life of King Anushirvan, for example. Does that make sense? And that this way of thinking about narrativization as theorization can have ripple effects then, in which many genres start to take up love as a productive way of engaging with philosophical, ethical, and political questions. So if you'd like more on that, I'm happy to answer questions. I know many of you have read the book, and I'd be happy to dive into the details. I also gave further discussions of this on some earlier book talks that you can see online. And you can also download the book for yourselves if you want to. But now for the fun part. I would like to tell you about part 2, which I'm starting to think of as a project I might call Love at the Limits, where I'm really interested in frontiers and translation, adaptation, and like these moments of encounter, basically. And I'll give you 2 short case studies that I think model what I'm talking about. As I said in the book, I on a book where I looked at these 3 formative romances, each chapter on, like a chapter on Gorgani, a chapter on Ayuri, and a chapter on Onsori. But I really felt that these other works were so interesting, I did not want to, I wanted to give myself space to really explore them. So that's what I'm kind of doing here now, is I'm interested in diving into the works of Onsori and Ayuri in particular. So I'm going to start by walking you through this story by Ayuri to tell you what I find interesting in it. This takes the cake now. It used to be Gorgani, but now it's Ayuri. It is known as the oldest extant Persian romantic masnavi that we have in full. It was probably composed around the 1030s. It is also is written by a poet who's otherwise unknown, named Ayuri. And interestingly, it's a direct adaptation of a famous Arabic love story of Urwa ibn Hazan. So we have source text to compare this to, and it then enjoys a very vibrant afterlife, being translated numerous times into Turkish and Kurdish, and has, I think, it seems to then flow into the oral ashik tradition of the Caucasus today. It also has intercalated proto-ghazals, which I'll talk more about in a moment, and it's an important landmark work in the history of Islamic painting. So the art historians have been poring over this manuscript for decades, and the literary historians need to catch up because, again, it's fallen under as being not worth studying as a literary text. To give you a little context where this is drawing from, it's drawing from what's called the Odri Arabic tradition, which famously is the source of the Layli Majnun story as well. But this is particularly the story of Urwa ibn Hazam, who has a story very much like the story of Layli Majnun. He falls in love with his cousin, they get separated, and they both die of broken hearts at the end. It's a tragic story of chaste love. When it's incorporated into the Persian text, it offers a really exciting opportunity to think about what I called in the book mode switching, which is like the way that modalities of speaking and of affect within that way of speaking intersect. And this offers even more opportunities for that because you have images, right? You have a title here saying, No hey kardane Shah. So this is Gul Shah being separated and lamenting her separation. Here's a picture, so you can explore the picture. You're following the Masnavi prose. It's in the Motaqarreb meter, just like the Shahnameh. So you get the story, you get the image, and then you get down here. Let me read my notes really quickly. We get Benalid o bar dar o hejran begoft, dariga shod az dastam on nik joft. So we get this speech act where Gosha then says, oh, alas, I've been separated from my beloved. And then we get Sher goftane Gosha dar hejre varge. And then the next poem, I'll read a few lines of it for you. She goes, Aya nos hato ra hato John eman, delo di deo John o John eman, to darman Johnny o dar deli, koja rafti e dar de darman eman. It's a ghazal. It has the form of a ghazal. You can see the neman, radif in here. So it's a song text in the middle of a story. So this raises really interesting questions for me about how is this performed? Would a reciter of this story been reading this out? Is the movement from Masnavi to Ghazal an invitation to sing or to declaim it differently? How would it interact with the images? There's a lot about like performance context I think this story can tell us. In addition to that aspect of things, and I think even like the way it responds to the Arabic lyric text is quite interesting. There's sometimes these poems seem to quote the Arabic sources. So like there's this famous, one of the lines in the Diwan of Urwa is فَقُلْتُ لِعَرَافِ يَمَامَتِي دَاوِنِي فَإِنَّكَ إِن دَوَيْتَنِي لَتَبِيبُ, right? If I told the sage, the doctor, cure me, for if you do, you're a doctor indeed. Ayuri responds with the same rhyme, saying, Agar behkuni marmara e habib, nabashad choto gerdagiti tabib. There's no doctor in the world like you if you can cure me. So the same semantic content moving from Arabic into Persian. So are we seeing like echoes or citations of the Arabic poems in this refiguration of the story? And the other thing that's interesting about the story is what I might call the accordion effect of romance, where you take the skeleton plot, and as Bakhtin famously puts it, you can just go and open it up. You can stretch it out as long as you want and insert new episodes into it, which might tell us a lot about audience expectations about what it means to tell a love story. Here's an example. With our first narrative text of this by Ibn Qutayba, we get a pretty simple breakdown of the boy and girl are cousins. They fall in love. The boy travels to Damascus, and while he's gone, the girl is married off. The boy finds out, he gets sick, the doctors can't cure him. They have a meeting, and then they basically say Qur'an Hafiz to each other, and then they separate and die of broken hearts. When Abul Faraj al-Isfahani, who retells the story about a century later, he gets to the story, he adds all kinds of interesting motifs that we would recognize in the romance genre. Now we have a greedy aunt, the evil stepmother motif, right? We have the two sidekicks, which is drawing from the Arabic tradition of the two friends that accompany the lover. We're upping the stakes from another cousin to now it's the Umayyad prince. So now we're getting political. The family breaks their promise. We have a false grave erected. The lover finds out. There's a token where he goes to Damascus and he puts his ring in a glass of milk. The girl finds it, realizes that her lover is there, and then they have that gives them an opportunity to meet and then not actually consummate their love, and so they then go back and die of a broken heart. When it gets to Ayuri, we get even more stuff that will be more and more recognizable for those of us who know the story of Layli Majnun. Now they fall in love at school, just like Layli Majnun fall in love at school in Nizami's version. Then we get a night raid, a Shabihun, where the bride is abducted and there's an epic battle to get her back, in which the girl, Golsha, kills her captor in disguise. So you have the warrior maiden motif. And then the greedy aunt postpones the marriage. More epic battles when they go to get money from the uncle. And then at the very end, this is the most interesting part, this tragic ending where the lovers die has a second ending attached on top of it, where the Prophet Muhammad appears and resurrects the lovers, not directly, but he intercedes on their behalf and God resurrects them, leading to a mass conversion of the people of Damascus to Islam. So here's a few examples. Here's the two lovers at school with the Mu'allim, you can see. Here's Golsha lancing her abductor on her horse. There he is, no match for her. And there's Varghe, who's trying to rescue her, but actually been thrown into prison, or he's in chains. So it's a really fun moment. And then here is the moment where the prophet appears and everyone is asked for his intercession, leading to the resurrection of the lovers from the grave. This is important. This is actually the first pictorial representation of the prophet that we have in Islamic art history. So what I find really interesting here is this idea of the mass conversion where, and I have an article about this called Spiderweb Stories, where you see almost the exact same story in the famous story of Fleur and Blanche Fleur that involves the separation of lovers, travel, and near the end, the sort of quality of the lovers' commitment to each other is so effective that it induces a mass conversion. In the case of Varghe and Golsha, it's from the Jewish population of Damascus to Islam, and in Fleur and Blanche Fleur, it's the mass conversion of the Muslim population of Al-Andalus to Christianity. So these are both tales that move across boundaries and are set in front, and they're commissioned in frontier zones. So I find it really interesting that this romance seems to be a way of managing questions of difference and thinking about the role, like the intertwining of erotic history with sacred history, you might say, of bringing love as a way of suturing romance into like triumphalist narratives of kings who convert, who like fight on the cause of whatever the right religion is. So, for example, in the course, this one sutures in the prophet, and in the Christian text sutures in Charlemagne. In both cases, they sort of stitch the romance into some kind of sacred history. To sum up, I'm interested in how this is a great early text to help us explore the relationship of Arabic into Persian, how Arabic stories are being adapted into new Persian literature at this formative stage. The kind of messy relationship between narrative and lyric poetry. The significance of the conversion motif, which helps us think about what are these texts doing for their audiences, and how they also point to these frontier zones, whether it's Seljuk Anatolia, Ghaznavid India, or Al-Andalus. The next text is even more wild. I'm saving the best for last. This is Onsuri's Valmeko Azra. This is written by the poet laureate of Mahmud of Ghazna's court. I actually am starting to think that we don't have these works anymore. We mostly remember Onsuri as a Qasideh poet. I'm starting to think, though, that he actually may have invented the romance genre in Persian literature, because he actually wrote 3 romances that are independent, and they're all lost. But if we had them, we may have a very different history of what this genre looked like. This may precede the Ayuri's text, and his source is from an ancient Greek novel called Meteokis and Parthenope, which was written 1,000 years prior. It's dated to the 1st century CE. So it's one of the earliest ancient Greek novels as well. And it was the same time that Onsuri writes this in Persian, his colleague, Abu Rayhan Biruni, writes a prose translation into Arabic of this. And so there's this massive interest in this story in the Ghaznavid court. It's translated from Greek into both Persian and into Arabic at the same time. So why? What is going on? Why would Onsuri versify this ancient Greek tale for his patron? And it's really interesting to juxtapose this with Biruni, who writes that these are just silly, and he says, I did this because he calls them ma yujri majra al-ahmadi min al-hazli wa sakhaf. Like, these are just silly and frivolous things to aid the digestion. That's the classic motif around love stories. They're just after dinner cocktails. You just tell them to have a nice time after you've done the serious work of the day. And interestingly, Onsuri does not at all domesticate his milieu. All the names are Greek. The milieu is Greek. It's steeped in polytheism. It's steeped in idolatry. Why does he not, like, what does he see in this? Why resurrect this 1,000-year-old text that has nothing Islamic apparently about it? Especially for a patron who prides himself as being the sort of champion of Islam in the realm of the infidels. I think that might be the key, because this is at a time when the Ghaznavid Empire is doing raids down into India and having yearly encounters with non-Muslim peoples in that region, right? Both Unsuri and Biruni are traveling south into India on an annual basis, encountering non-Muslim communities constantly, and usually, attacking and enslaving or pillaging them. But I think that milieu really matters in thinking about why this text might be important. And I want to detour for a moment to think about how Biruni engages with India in his famous Malul Hind, in his famous, What is in India. The prologue of his work, which is a famous anthropological study of India, begins by saying that there's an incommensurate difference between we and the people of India. He says, "In al-qawma yabayununa bijami'a ma yashtaraku fihi al-umam." This people differs from us in everything that all other peoples take part in. And la yaqa minna shay'un min al-aqrabi ma anduhum wa la minhum shay'un mimma andina. There's nothing in what we assert that they would confirm, nor the other way around. There's an absolute incommensurable difference between India and us, meaning the Muslims, basically. And yet, therefore, how do you talk about something that is almost that cannot be described because it's so different? He turns to the ancient Greeks, calling them, interestingly, al-Yunaniyun ayyam al-Jahiliyyah. The Jahiliyyah meaning the time before Islam. So he says, the heathen Greeks before Christianity held much the same opinion as the Hindus. Their integrated classes thought much the same as those of the Hindus. Their common people held the same idolatrous views, fi abadullah Islam. Therefore, I like to confront the theories of the one nation with those of the other on account of their close relationship. So you can't talk directly about India, but you can talk around to India through the Yunaniyun ayyam al-Jahiliyyah, through the ancient Greeks. So when we go to Unsuri's text, we see this really interesting work being done, because Unsuri's text is also very anthropological. He goes into these long discourses about what people did. It's not just the love story. So this is the meeting of the lovers. So the classic motif to back up in the Greek romances is that the lover and the boy and the girl will meet at the gates of a temple, see each other for the first time, and fall in love. So he's following the Greek text. They meet each other at the temple of Hera. They fall in love. And then he says, I'm going to tell you more about this temple. Chonandon ke in heikal az pahlavi bovad name bot khane ta beshnavi. Beruzan hame mardaman sar be sar shodandi bedan heikal namvar. Hame pish an bot shodandi faraz baronik bordi be pishesh namaz. Az ou khastandi hame ray khish gerefte bodandi delaray khish. چنان بود آیین که شاه و سپاه به هیکل پیاده شدندی به راه و اگر نامور تاج داری بودی هر آنگه که در پیش آن بود شدی. Know that this temple, when you listen, is the name for idol house in Pahlavi, or Bodkhane in Pahlavi. So again, he's using Pahlavi to gloss the Akkadian word heikal to draw some kind of equivalence between ancient Greece, Sasanian, and the present. And then he says, back then, all the people, good and bad, would go to that temple, come up to the idol, and pay homage to it. They would seek their counsel from it, having taken it as their beloved. Such was the custom that king and soldier would go to the temple on foot. I don't know about you, but this is suddenly making me think of the Hajj ritual, of this ritual practice that brings that erases class differences, and all people, great and small, come to it to beseech intercession from the deity, such that even if you're famous and wore a crown, he would go before that in such a way at that time. It seems to be a way of trying to make this ancient Greek milieu legible in a way that made sense for Unsuri's audience. And just as I think Biruni, and I have other examples that I won't go into, the invention of the lyre, the depictions of love, there's a lot of interesting material in this text. But in both cases, we see this idea that you can actually encounter something that seems on the surface to be utterly different, but use thinking to extract some kind of wisdom or understanding about how people live their lives in a way that can benefit you in some way. So just as Onsori, or just as Biruni says, there's absolutely no commensurability between Hindu idolatry and Islamic belief, but actually you can if you triangulate it through the lens of ancient Greece. So too, you can arrive at this idea that indeed the Hindus practice Islam outside of Islam. Biruni comes to this fascinating conclusion in chapter 2 that despite having already said that there's nothing that the Muslims believe that the Hindus would believe and vice versa, he ends up by saying, but actually, when you get past these superficial differences, the people of India believe that God is singular, eternal, without beginning or end, resembling nothing and nothing resembling him, a very Islamic statement outside of the framework of Islam itself. So to wrap up then, and I can give you some more examples of this in the text, but I think Onsori is very interesting by reviving this ancient Greek text and saying this is useful for you because it helps you manage difference. It helps you recognize something familiar in the unrecognizable. And again, I think that question of limits, of margins, of borders might be a really useful way to thematize this question. What does it mean to write at the frontier as a way of expanding one's knowledge and encountering difference that cannot, at least on first blush, be absorbed or made sensible within your own frameworks? So a really interesting thing that happens in this text are allusions to what I might call antediluvian prophets. Enoch, Idris, Hermes, Trismegistos, like these people who have knowledge of God before revelation. And so this text seems to posit, again, Islam outside of Islam that's possible and recoverable in this ancient Greek story, such as the encapsulated with the Milal Hanafiya. And so with that, I will end my overly long talk. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to our conversation.